particularly Pastor Covington, Bishop Fulton, and Dr. Vereen. Thank you all so much for all your hard work. Dr. Vereen is going to get us started with some of the rules of engagement for this morning. So Dr. Vereen.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Morning. Few rules of engagement and housekeeping, as Laura said. I am the co-chair for Social Justice for the Ministers Conference of Winston-Salem and vicinity. Also, the pastor here at Providence Baptist Church here in this sprawling metropolis of Kernersville, North Carolina. Glad to be with you all this morning. So just a few rules. I sort of mapped out about 4 rules here, and let me just go through them quickly as we proceed. The first rule is there's going to be a 3-minute allotted time for each speaker. After those 3 minutes, unfortunately, we will have to mute you so that we can move on to allow time for responses to your question or your statement. So after 3 minutes, you will be muted, and we will move on to allow time for the participation of others as well who have joined us for this important discussion. Rule number 2, please be concise and succinct as possible in your questions, comments, or your suggestions. Rule 3, let's remember that we're working together, that we are unified to try to find solutions to the problems that we are facing, and that these problems are long-standing, and that it's going to take more than just a 90-second a 90-minute phone call or Zoom platform for us to be able to address the full magnitude of what we are facing in an effort to achieve true equity in the system or in the systems. And finally, let us be professional and respectful of one another in our motives, in our pursuits, and in our passions today. And remember that servants are never self-serving. In an effort that I not be the first violator of rule number 1 of 3 minutes, I'm going to pass the baton on now to our distinguished president of the Ministers Conference of Winston-Salem and vicinity, Pastor Timbula Covington.
Good morning, everyone. Good to see you. Thank you so much, Attorney General Josh Stein, and Laura Brewer for assisting us, for allowing us to assist you and galvanizing all of the contact information, and for inviting us into this dialogue. I am here to thank you first and foremost, but also would like to honor and recognize all of our elected officials that are on the call, to recognize all of our civil rights organizations. We have from the Triad area our NAACP chapters, as well as the Urban League of Winston-Salem and vicinity. We also have our ministerial alliances that are here with us on today that I would like to give gratitude and thanks to. So thank you everyone for having joined, accepted the invitation to come here. But most of all, Attorney General Josh Stein, thank you for this invitation. At this time, I put this order of our business in the hands of our most capable communication director, Laura Brewer.
Thank you so much. Just one more final announcement, which is that, of course, we hope everyone is going to get a chance to speak today, but we do have a large group and a limit of 90 minutes. So if you have something that you want to add or an idea you want to share, please put that in the chat box. And when you do, please add your email address. We'll try to address all of the questions in the chat box, but if we don't have time to get to it, your email address will help us follow back up again. So now I'll turn it over to Attorney General Josh Stein.
Thank you very much, Laura, Pastor Covington, and Dr. Vereen. Really appreciate everyone's time this morning. And what we hope to do, Associate Justice Anita Earls, who will be with us as well, we are co-leading a task force that the governor has created. All of us were sickened by the video of Mr. George Floyd being killed, and the callousness with which the officer did that. And it really has forced a reckoning on race, on a whole host of issues, but in particular on the criminal justice system. And so the governor asked Justice Earls and me to co-lead this task force that he's put together, about 24, 25 people. And he was very clear. He said, I'm not looking for a commission to write some blue ribbon report that goes up on a shelf somewhere. I want an action-oriented task force that is actually identifying and then helping to implement meaningful change that can make our system fairer for all North Carolinians. And so our task force has been hard at work already. We've had 2 full meetings of the task force, and even in the second meeting already, we identified 3 recommendations. One was a ban on chokeholds by law enforcement. 2 is a duty on law enforcement to intervene when they see another law enforcement acting outside their scope, and to report that to a supervisor. And then a third recommendation was to the Supreme Court, urging it to pass a rule that judges take into account a person's ability to pay before levying a fine or fee, so that we are not criminalizing poverty. We understand those are just the first initial steps. They're because we had broad consensus of the task force to move on those, but we have so much more work to do. We've divided our work into 4 sections, 4 different working groups, and each of those working groups are tackling a host of different ideas. We don't believe we've got exclusive claim on good ideas. And so we've already had one statewide public forum where members of the public could sign up and share their ideas with us. And now you are the first of a series of regional meetings that we're going to do with community leaders and members to hear from you what ideas you want us. We're still in early days. We're working hard. We're meeting every week, every 2 weeks, and a lot of work between meetings. But we want to hear from you to make sure we're doing everything we possibly can to make our system fair. In terms of this meeting, we're going to split it into 2 sections. We're going to have a section on law enforcement and a section on the courts and post-conviction. And I will moderate the first section and Justice Earls will moderate the second. So at this point, I will hand it off to Justice Earls for some preliminary comments, and then we will start with talking about law enforcement. Justice Earls.
Well, thank you very much, Attorney General Stein. Good morning, everyone. I am enormously grateful to you for taking the time this morning to be with us. I'm also grateful to the governor for recognizing that the courts do matter in the criminal justice system, and so for allowing me to serve as co-chair of this task force. I do think it's important the stage of the process that we're in. As Attorney General Stein explained, we've had 2 task force meetings. We've also had each of the work groups meet once already. And so that means that these listening sessions are truly an opportunity to both recognize that there may be regional differences, there may be things that are different in different parts of the state, and that we need to be aware of that and hear about that. But I also think that beyond just identifying the problems, which of course it's really important that we understand what are the issues, how are they different in different parts of the state, what should we be trying to address. We also are at a point where we need to hear more about what are solutions. And part of the reason for having this listening session is to be a little more interactive and to hear from local leaders. So thank you so much for participating and engaging with us. And so I want to say a word about solutions. I think that it's so important that we be careful to recommend things that we know will work. All of this effort in identifying the problems and coming up with recommendations, if we don't come up with things that actually work, then we won't be successful. And then beyond that, we have to be able to actually implement them. And that's another place where all of you come into play, because this task force alone, despite the fact that it is an amazing collection of 24 people from across the state, all different types of stakeholders who have committed to an implementation of recommended changes, and changes that work, not just change for change's sake. We can't do it alone. We can't wave our magic wand after we produce our report on December 1st and make all those things happen. It's really leaders like you across the state who will make things happen. And I just want to emphasize that for me, a meaningful analog is remembering that yesterday was the 55th anniversary of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And just thinking about the history of all that we've had to do to implement that guarantee of equal opportunity to participate in our democracy, they're really, I think, it's both sobering, but also I think something to give us reason for faith, reason for hope that we can make a difference. And so the final thing I want to say is that before I came on the court, in 30 years as a civil rights attorney, it's certainly a matter of public record that I sued numerous police departments around the state, including the Guilford County Sheriff's Department and more recently the Greensboro Police Department. And so I have some sense of the limitations of using the legal system to try to implement reforms, but I also have some sense of some of the issues and some of the concerns. And so I hope that in this listening session, we'll be able to hear from folks who have similarly been engaged in change efforts and what has worked and what hasn't worked. I know that Greensboro, for example, has a community relations commission with police oversight. Police civilian review boards has been something that one of the working groups has already been talking about. So information about how is that working? How could it work better? What has your experience been? We really, truly can learn a lot from each of you. And so without further ado, I'm really looking forward to listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justice Earls. So the first half of our conversation is going to concern law enforcement. And I'm going to break this topic up into a few subparts because obviously it's a broad topic. I want to talk about use of force. I want to talk about culture and accountability. I want to talk about training and recruitment, all of things that are important if we want law enforcement and the community to work together, because that's the only way that we can have successful public safety is when the public has confidence in law enforcement and law enforcement is of the community and we are working in partnership to keep people safe because the public safety is paramount. So to start, we will discuss use of force. If Mr. James Perry from the Urban League Winston-Salem is on, would very much welcome hearing his comments and thoughts on that topic.
Attorney General Stein and Justice Earls, thank you for having me and all of us from the Winston-Salem, Forsyth County area, and of course the Triad. We appreciate this. I'm going to try to be quick within these 3 minutes. So first of all, I really appreciate the progress so far on ending poverty policing, as I would term it. I would urge that this committee go a step further and not leave this in the hands of judges. Presumably, the arrest shouldn't happen in the first place. And so I think the idea here is to come up with policy that prevents people from being arrested because of poverty ever, right? And so it's one of the things that I like to champion for Chief Thompson here in Winston-Salem. Over the last 6 years, we've seen a reduction by half of people being arrested over basic poverty issues. So that's number one. We want this as a systemic issue, not an issue that judges have to fix later. Second is of course, I think you guys have an appropriate focus on limiting the use of force, and I can't say enough about how far you have to go to ensure that that police are focused on using force as an absolute last resort. Then I think the most important issue at this point for us at the Urban League perhaps is probably transparency around body cams. So we go so far to make sure that there are body cameras available for police officers, but it's so hard now to be able to actually see the body cameras. And it's frustrating, I think, on both sides. On one side, it means that if someone is a victim of an illegal use of force, they can't fully tell their story and can't fully prove what their experience was. But also, in some circumstances, body cam evidence actually exonerates police officers. And so even police officers aren't able to fully tell their stories. So the legislation that restricts the ability to share body camera footage so heavily, I think really does a strong disservice to the public. Those are, so obviously there are a plethora of issues that we're concerned about and that we're always focused on, but within these 3 minutes, those are the three that I would urge this committee to take a look at and to focus on.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. In fact, yesterday, the work group that is focused on this issue of accountability for law enforcement. The very issue you just discussed about body camera, one, having it be universally deployed on officers, the body worn cameras, and to review the ways in which that footage can be viewed. Is it too restrictive under current law? And so that is a topic. Obviously, use of force it's the issue that the George Floyd killing just brought to the fore. And so we're all focused on it. And as I mentioned, I was really proud of our task force for acting immediately on that topic. And I just also want to add that the ban on chokeholds is not the end of our review of the issue of use of force. It was just the first thing we wanted to address. We know that there's more work to be done there. And the idea that you pointed out about preventing poverty arrests, that just statistically, the more interactions there are between law enforcement and the community, the more incidents that go south will happen. And so we know that there are times when law enforcement have to get involved. We know that there are public safety issues where people are at risk, and law enforcement should, and we want them there. But if they're getting involved with people in a kind of an adversarial fashion when it's not essential, it does increase the risk of negative interactions. So thank you for those comments. Bishop Fulton, if you would talk to us and share some ideas on the issues of culture and accountability of law enforcement from your perspective.
Well, from my perspective, and thank you, Josh, from my perspective, the criminal justice system is heavily impacted by the bias of police mentality, as well as outdated judicial policy. So from my perspective, we're going to have institutions and community leaders like we have now. The NAACP, the Urban League, and the Ministers Conference in this Triad area are working. And we didn't just start working after George Floyd. We have been working for decades now to deal with the injustices when it comes to racial biases and brutality when it comes to law enforcement. So white folk are awake now. Black folk have been living a nightmare for over 400 years. So these three institutions and organizations, NAACP, Urban League, and the local ministers' conferences have been working and organizing. We've been working with our police departments, our sheriff's departments, and the only way we're going to do this is we have to work together. In this culture, in this climate, it's easy for one institution to put the blame on another institution. And locally in Winston-Salem, I could say that we have been very successful with working with our police chief, Chief Thompson. We've been very successful with working with our district attorney, Jim O'Neill, and very successful working with our sheriff, Sheriff Kimbrough. So if we allow the community or the media to pit us against each other, there's an African proverb that says, when two elephants fight, only the grass suffer. Our community will suffer if we don't come together and work as a collective force. So in this culture, in this climate, it's challenging for the Ministers' Conference to work with the police department and the sheriff department. It's challenging for the African-American community to even have trust in these institutions, because after all, these are the same institutions before the Voting Act was passed 55 years ago. These are the same challenges. These are the same institutions that kept Black folk from voting and from registering to vote, was law enforcement. So we have the opportunity to change that with our vote and our voice. And in this culture, we're able to do that. So once again, Justice Earl and Attorney Stein, we want to thank you guys for choosing to collaborate and hear the voice of the people. Thank you.
Bishop Fulton, thank you for those comments. The work group that is talking about law enforcement issues, they've said, first thing we got to do is make sure that we're recruiting the right people into law enforcement. And right people means a lot of different things. You got the people who want to go into this kind of profession, who have that guardian mentality of wanting to take care of other people. But then sometimes it attracts the warrior mentality, the people who want to kind of break through things. And we want to make sure we're bringing in the public spirited people on the front end. And then we also want to make sure that law enforcement reflects the communities they serve. And that requires aggressive outreach to ensure that the composition has the right makeup of African Americans, has the right percentage of women and Latinos and all the people who are served by law enforcement in the public. And so these are issues we're wrestling with, and I appreciate your raising that and underscoring that there has to be trust, and trust isn't something you switch on with a light switch. Trust is earned over time, and I think we all know that we have to build that trust. So thank you, Bishop. I want to talk about the issue of training, and Sheriff Kimbrough is on to join us. And just a quick word. Obviously, we don't want to get in to the specifics of the case of Mr. John Neville in terms of the particular officers, but I think we can talk about the broader issue. And I do want to recognize that he immediately called for an independent investigation by the SBI after Mr. Neville's death. And that's actually something we were discussing yesterday as a best practice that we as a task force may recommend statewide, that whenever there is a death in custody, that you call in an independent organization to come do that review and investigation. But what we don't, we want to stop the deaths from happening in the first place. We don't want to have to worry about having to investigate them on the back end. And so, Sheriff Kimbrough, can you talk to us about training and ideas that you have in that regard, please?
Yes, sir. Good morning, Mr. Stein. Good morning, Chief Justice Earl. I appreciate you all being here in the Ministers' Conference. All of you, good morning, Mr. Perry, and all of you that are present here this morning. Training is so very key. Training is a reflection of, in a critical situation, people will respond to flight or flight or their training, the level of training. So I think that we've got to make sure that the men and women that serve and protect us have a certain level of training. Training not only how to do the job, but sensitivity, training of recognizing the people that they serve, understanding the various cultures. And so most of you know what has happened here. We have increased the level of training to the point of integrated training, to the level of having a 24-hour paramedic present inside of the detention center, thinking outside the box, because at the end of the day, you're managing people, you're managing lives, and you're responsible for that. And so your training has to represent that. And every now and then in life, there's these defining moments which cause you to look inward and look at how you're doing something. Is it the best practice? And so training is paramount in how you serve the people. And so we have increased the training from integrated training to now we have 50 people starting next week that will be trained in paramedic life skill survivals. We've talked about, as you just talked about, banning certain practices, techniques. I could go on beyond my 3 minutes, but I think that as this law enforcement issue, we've got to make sure that we have community credibility. We've got to make sure that we serve the community not before we show up to enforce the law, but serve the community long before we get there. We've got to have representation. As you and I have talked, Mr. Attorney General, one thing that would be great is to have a social justice coordinator in every county that would deal with issues that citizens have as it relates to policing in their communities, that would have the ability to make those complaints directly to the AG's office, where it would have bite, it would have teeth, and things could be done. So there's a plethora of things that we could talk about for days, but training has to be at the forefront. Law enforcement has changed in so many different ways from what it used to be 36 years ago when I entered into this profession. So I think that training has to be key when we put this task force together, training and those that we are training, sir.
Sheriff Kimbrough, thank you very much. I want to give a special thanks to Sheriff Kimbrough, because he was one of the first people who came up with this idea of the task force, and he said we need to have regional meetings. And so he is a big thinker who is making an impact more than just in Forsyth County. And Sheriff, I know that you have obviously spent more time thinking about the training that should be required for detention officers in jails. And if you would have your folks email our office the list of ideas that you've been implementing so that we can consider those for statewide application, because we don't want any unnecessary deaths. And before I go to Chief Thompson, just want to give greetings to Sheriff Rogers from Guilford. Appreciate your being here as well, Sheriff. Chief Thompson, I've talked a bit about the issue of recruitment. How do you go about doing that? How do you go about recruiting a workforce that reflects your community? That mute button.
That might help. Again, thank you, Attorney General Stein and Justice Earls for having us as part of this discussion. I'm gonna try to stay within my 3 minutes, but I do have a lot to say. The work of building a better police department is ongoing. And I'm not just talking about how we recruit the next generation, but how we write policies around compensation to positions our departments to build a better and greater trust with our community. So everyone in the law enforcement world signed up for this because of the salary, right? Of all of the career options that were in front of us, this one provided the best salary, opportunity for advancement, and at the end of your career, you have the golden handcuffs known as the fixed pension. That's not likely, right, for many of us in this profession. When we talk to new officers, we hear that they join to make a difference, to serve, to improve their community, or events to continue a family tradition. They may have had an interaction with an officer as a child or early in adulthood that set off a calling or lingering question in the mind that brought them to our door. Those stories can be powerful, and I'll show you how we use them to recruit. Here in Winston-Salem, we have the process of recruiting that starts with finding interested young people. In 2014, we reached out to our marketing communications department and asked for help in this arena. I'll pause here and just say, if you have a marketing communications department within your city government, I encourage you as a law enforcement agency to partner with them and use that. Their skill and expertise can be amazing and great value to your recruiting efforts. We partnered with ours to take advantage of their expertise in the use of technology and strategies to reach specific audiences. So since 2014, marketing communications has helped us get our message out through getting stories into the local news markets and onto our own city's webpage or cable station, and placing advertisements into television, radio, direct mail, social media platforms like, of course, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, as well as YouTube, Google, and internet radios like Pandora and Spotify. One of the tools we work with in our recent years was telling the stories of our current officers. One series we used as recently as last year was a series where our officers appear on camera answering the question why they became a police officer and what keeps them coming back every day. The story of why you became an officer can be a perspective, can help a prospective candidate identify why they may want to do it as well. Don't discount the personal stories. We still utilize job fairs, trade shows in our area, and we travel outside Long Island, New York to recruit, but personal stories matter. When we go to New York, the representatives from our department are men and women who came from that area. There is no strategy that works every time, but finding a good partner using the latest technologies and stories of why you and your staff choose law enforcement can be impactful. Not all recruitment efforts are about hiring immediately. One particular effort is about creating a long-term engagement or relationship. We're partners in the production of the Winston-Salem Forsyth County 9/11 Public Safety Challenge. This is a high school ROTC special event where our officers work with judges of 10 from this area, ROTC programs And we work with them to develop relationships with the young people in those programs who have already demonstrated an interest in our profession. Developing relationships with people from our community to build interest in this profession. It does something else too. It reaches young people who already called our community their home. There is thought that says there's no correlation in how an officer does his or her job based on where he lives. I can't speak to that because I have lived here in Winston-Salem since I started my career here. My husband and I raised our children here, and we've always lived in good communities. And we as police advocate for more raises or benefits. We help fund those benefits when we live in the communities that we serve. Being in the community you serve really matters. Not related to my profession, I carry a personal desire to see my community safer and more vibrant. It's why I became a police officer, and working daily in my profession only strengthens that desire. Law enforcement has changed over my 26 years. We didn't used to allow officers to grow beards or to have tattoos when I first started with this organization. So flexibility is important, and the ability to evolve as your society and your candidates for the positions evolve. So if change is evidence, perhaps a day is coming when cities will consider paying employees to live within the city. How do you do that? Perhaps waiving what most employees consider to be one of the main reasons why they choose to live outside the city that they serve, and that is their property taxes. Consider incentivizing officers or employees who live within the city by raising or waiving a certain percentage of their property taxes. Law enforcement has does it change how one would patrol a community with a high rate of calls? Does living in our community change how you interact with the next motorist during a traffic stop? I say it does. The person is not a resident of a town or city far from their own. They're my neighbor. Perhaps the next day is coming when we see this as an investment as important as economic incentives to bring the next tech giant into our community. Paying the full tax bill of a law enforcement officer or even a part of that could change it, and not just law enforcement, but any city employees. We want officers who know the law, know their tools and tactics, know they are valued and respected, and we want officers who will let all that inside and serve their communities with integrity.
Thank you very much, Chief Thompson. Really appreciated all your comments. The idea of recruiting the right people on the front end. One program that my office has pushed that Senator Lowe, the legislature, enacted was the CJ Fellows program, which is modeled on the Teaching Fellows program. We want to identify those public-spirited young people in high school and tell them, we'll pay for your education. We'll pay for your 2 years of community college if you go and work as a law enforcement officer for 4 years. And Senator Lowe, I need you to work on your colleagues because they authorized the program, but they left out big counties like Guilford and Forsyth, which is a shame. And they didn't give us any money to pay for the kids' scholarships. So they've authorized the program, but it hasn't been fully funded yet. So that's one thing. You talked about the importance, Chief Thompson, of having people from the community in the department. And I met with Chief Buffalo when I was out in Elizabeth City a few months ago, and he was having trouble keeping people on the payroll. That, you know, invariably he would train them up, and then some bigger city police department would take his trained officers. And what he discovered was he needed to recruit people from the region, from Elizabeth City and surrounding counties, because he wanted people who were committed to living in that community, because they were the ones who had an emotional attachment to that community and therefore provided a higher level of service. And one thing on recruitment that I appreciated all your innovative ways to get job postings out to different demographics and communities that a traditional job fair might touch. Chief Davis in Durham told me when she started in the Durham Police Department that the unit of officers who did community outreach and recruiting were all white. And there was nothing malicious about that. It's just, if you want a young African-American high schooler to feel like that's something I can do, you have to make sure that your recruitment team is similarly diverse and that it can't just be of one ethnicity, one ethnic group. So we all understand we need to have these public spirited people serving our community, the guardian mentality, the ones who really want to take care of other people. And then we have to train them up right. And if they ever do wrong, we need to hold them accountable. And these are all the issues that we are wrestling with as a task force. Celeste Holcomb just put a comment out there for everyone's consideration, talking about the importance of crisis intervention training for police, that it is part of some of the in-service training that officers are required to have. But she asks whether there'd be willingness by police departments and cities to have non-police first responders specialized in mental health emergency response, either independently or in conjunction with law enforcement in responding to crisis. And I don't know if Chief or Mayor Joines or Mayor Vaughn, if that's something that you all have been considering to implement.
Attorney General, this is Alan Joines. Thank you for hosting this call. I'm so very proud of our own police department and starting to build the trust that's necessary. And I certainly agree with Bishop Fulton's comments that you just don't do that immediately. It's something that happens over years, if not decades, that we stood together with the Ministers' Conference on many, many issues. Chief Thompson can certainly add to this, but our officers now receive implicit bias training. A number of our officers have gone through training from the Institute for Dismantling Racism. And we've actually had, just recently, to your point, some, I guess, requests for social justice individuals within the police department, I think even within the sheriff's department. So that's something that we're looking at right now. I would say that our police department is so way ahead of a number of places there. The so-called 8 can't wait criteria that I'm sure everyone's seen. I think we can check just about every one of those boxes. And the fact that we've had a civilian police review board in place for going on 30 years, and it's been a great tool as well. But to answer your question, I think we're certainly looking at those issues of perhaps adding some additional civilian, particularly in the mental health area, in terms of being able to assist our officers out there. We ask so much of our officers when they go on a call, to not only be an enforcement, but also a counselor, a mental health expert, in some cases a medical expert. So I think the more training we can get and the more assistance we can get for them will be good. But again, thank you for hosting this call here in the Triad, and I certainly appreciate my colleagues, Mayor Vaughn, Mayor Wagner, for joining us.
I would like to add.
Yes. Thanks,
Attorney General, thank you for putting this together. And to Celeste's question regarding adding mental health workers to the police department, the city of Greensboro instituted a program that we put into action just in March of this past year, where we have subcontracted with some mental health workers. And when somebody calls 911, if the dispatcher feels that there is a mental health component or an addiction component, they will dispatch GPD, but they will also dual dispatch these mental health workers at the same time. The police department gets there, they secure the scene, and when the scene is safe, they bring the mental health workers in. The police is then able to leave the scene and leave them with some mental health workers. So the police are on the scene for a much shorter period of time. They're able to leave, and it gives the people who make the call some immediate assistance with these mental health workers, and then some follow-up afterwards. The program, it took a long time for us to bring it together. It was kind of a year in the making, and it did just start in March, but we have gotten really good reviews for it. And we're not only using it just for our police department. We know that other city departments have issues as well, that sometimes people show up in our libraries and that they're under stress for different reasons. And the people in the library department are able to call these mental health workers in, or that we could have somebody in code enforcement who goes out and that they find themselves in a situation. So they're able to call the mental health workers. So this is a program that's just started, but we think that it's going to show really good results in a number of different areas.
Mayor Vaughn, thank you for that. And as you, as well, Mayor Joins, the issue of civilian review boards is something that obviously our task force is looking at. And so, Mayor Joins, if we can have somebody on our team follow up with you to learn about how you structured it in Winston-Salem, because that can inform our work. And Mayor Vaughn, one thing I've heard from law enforcement officers themselves is their frustration with being asked to be responsible for all of society's ills, and frankly, the failure of our healthcare system to deal with mental health and to deal with addiction. And so what ends up happening is that the jails, the police end up being the final repository, the catchment for all of our society's issues. And they're being asked to not only be peace officers, but they're being asked to be mental health counselors and social workers and drug addiction counselors. And we need them to be educated and trained in the basics on all of those things, but we can't expect them to have the same level of knowledge and expertise as a professional social worker who's got a career in those areas. And so I'm very excited to hear about what Greensboro is doing. And we definitely want to learn from you all about that to, again, see if it has statewide application. So thanks very much, Mayor.
Thank you.
We have a couple more minutes for this part of our discussion about law enforcement. We're going to be moving on to the courts and post-conviction shortly. But at this point, I'll open it up. If anyone on the call has something in maybe 60 seconds or less that they would like to share with the task force, we would welcome hearing from you. You can just either unmute yourself or do a show hands or, yes, Ms. Thomas.
Hi, I have met some really pleasant police officers, but I've also met some who felt it was appropriate to finger their guns just casually when stopping you for a traffic stop. And I think that power for even the nicest person can make someone more callous. And with cops, it makes them callous and armed. I think it's good to recruit the right people, but we want to see strong accountability because there's always going to be a jerk. And I want to be able to feel as safe with the jerks as I can with the nicest person. And no data shows that more Black police officers or officers from the community are less likely to actually commit violence against people who they're policing. Like, I just haven't seen any data that proves that. And trust can be earned, but a big thing that you all can do is to make cops accountable for paying out their lawsuits for misconduct, like getting rid of qualified immunity. And we talk about building trust, and trust can be earned, but if I know that you can murder me and get away with it, I don't trust you. If you're a cop, I don't care how many pictures you're taking with smiling Black children, how much you give to local charities. If I know that you can kill me or harm me with impunity, I don't just not trust our system, I don't trust you. And so repairing that trust means repairing the system so that cops can be accountable to people at least as much as we're expected to be accountable to them. And that wouldn't just mean that cops, it wouldn't just make them more accountable, it would also give financial resources for our cities because we wouldn't be paying out these lawsuits. And Mayor Vaughn would have more like space in her inbox because we wouldn't be inboxing her constantly about the Marcus Smith case because she's trying to preserve city resources. That should be the cops' jobs. They murdered him, they should pay. And then also the civilian review boards, they should have teeth. There's no purpose in having a body that can, ours can't even see all the information. I know Mayor Vaughn, you had said that they can. I have people who are sitting on that thing, they cannot see it. People who they've only received 4 cases over the past 18 months that they've been active. So like, they need to not only be able to see it, but they need disciplinary power. And that's not something the local governments can provide, but if you all can move on that, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Well, Ms. Thomas, thank you very much for your comments. Anyone else? And yeah, if you can keep it to about a minute, that would be really great. Ms. Battle?
Dr. Battle, sorry.
Sorry, I didn't know that.
That's okay. So I just want to point out a couple of things. First, when we're talking about accountability, calling in the SBI to do investigations does not equal accountability. The SBI is a law enforcement agency that's affiliated with CALEA and a number of other law enforcement agencies. And so if we talk about it, accountability, we need to make sure that these are external agencies who are conducting investigations, because we know that law enforcement cannot police the bad acts of law enforcement. I also want to reiterate the points made by Ms. Thomas, just to make it 100% clear. As a sociologist and a social scientist, data are very important. And we know that there's very little to no data that support the idea that more law enforcement, more Black or brown law enforcement equal better outcomes for Black and brown people in policing. We know that more law enforcement equals more police contact, and we know more police contact equals brutality and, unfortunately, in many times deaths for Black and brown people with whom they come into contact with. So, in the beginning of this discussion, we talked about making sure, I think Justice Earls mentioned that in the recommendations that we offer, we need to make sure that they're evidence-based. And so the social science research tells us that more law enforcement and also training, implicit bias training, there's very little research that demonstrates that equals better outcomes for police officers in any shape or form.
Thank you, Dr. Battle, very much. Appreciate that. Okay, at this point, Justice Earls, I'll hand it off.
Attorney Stein, I raised my hand, but I don't know if you saw it.
I didn't. Go ahead, Ms. Hightower, and then we'll move on to Justice Earls.
Yeah, and I'm gonna make this very brief.
Okay.
Just to piggyback on the one thing about the PCRB, Police Community Review Boards, I'd like for this task force to really look into how we get subpoena power, because right now there is no teeth, as Casey Thomas talked about, into that. And really, it's not a very effective tool of investigation, because police are investigating themselves. And then the community piece of that means that somebody's either looking at a case after it's founded or unfounded. And there's really no true independent investigation of situations. So I'd like the task force to really look into this subpoena power, because that's the only way I think we're going to see a radical change there.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hightower. Okay, Justice Earls.
Yes, thank you. And actually, if I could just really quickly follow up with Dr. Battle, I'm just curious on your views or your knowledge about what does work, right? So is there data we should be looking at, or case studies or examples of what would reduce the racial disparities in policing?
Addressing the systems that force people to resort to crime and have to have police contact in the first place. And so we have not, I know that this task force is focusing on racial equity in criminal justice. And one of the ways that we achieve racial equity is dealing with the circumstances that create extreme poverty, that force certain communities to be more heavily policed, more heavily surveilled, to have more police contact. We can't look at criminal justice and law enforcement in a vacuum. And so we really need to move away from thinking about interpersonal or micro level solutions to what are macro and systemic issues around poverty, around employment, around educational opportunities. These things are not disconnected. They're in fact 100% intersectional and connected.
Thank you. And I would say, the governor created another task force, the Andrea Harris task force, and we have preliminarily talked about ways in which the work and the missions of those two task force, which I see as the Andrea Harris task force as taking on certainly the issue of employment, healthcare, some of these other issues that you've identified. And we have talked about ways our two task force should work together and collaborate. So thank you for that input. So we are moving to the court system, and we're going to start again with talking about some specific issues and then open it up for everyone to give us their feedback and input. So looking at court practices and accountability issues, we're first going to hear from Ms. Holcomb on the pretrial release and bail issues. Thank you.
So I was going to mention that I work with the Forsyth County Community Bail Fund and Forsyth Court Support. And all of us who've kind of worked deeply in the courts with justice in mind understand that fines and fees criminalize poverty, like Josh Stein said. And but we noticed that, you know, there has to be an endpoint to this understanding. That endpoint must be the total elimination of fines and fees. And so any of the steps made towards this, like considering people's financial situation, has to be not opt-in. So we need an actionable step in addition to that, like having a limit to fines and fees be at a certain percentage of people's income or assets. The other thing that we do is to try to get people out of custody as quickly as possible by paying their bail, which alleviates that economic stress for them, but also tries to make it so that time in custody where they can be injured or killed is lowered. And this is not something that we do like for fun or enjoy doing this. We just want to keep people alive. And so our goal is to have you all make our efforts obsolete and put us out of business. So that's that's our view on bail reform. We should end cash bail.
Let me ask you, there's feedback about your experience with, can you tell me a little bit more about your program providing bail for folks? How does it work and what has been your experience with it?
Yes, so mainly it's individual to the bail fund communications. We've tried to identify people on the medical floor who are most at risk of coronavirus, and everyone is at risk from that, but people that are like most medically fragile, trying to bail them out and bailing out kind of as many people as possible rather than finding people with like really high bail. And literally it's just like go there, bail people out. They're in jail, so they're not, you know, guilty. They're they're you know, presumed innocent. So if they have a bail, they're allowed to leave if we can pay it. So this is the Forsyth County Community Bail Fund, and then we have an umbrella group called Forsyth Court Support, which has the Prisoner Outreach Initiative. We have a jail support team. We have the bail fund. We have Court Watch through Siembra and through Housing Justice Now. And so it's a big group of us that all work together to try to support people through the carceral system, since we know that it's very like taxing and dangerous system to go through for people.
And one final question, does your program have any information or data available about how many people that you provide bail for then do actually come back to court and deal with their charges?
It seemed, I mean, so far, I think that everyone has, because we get the money back and we maintain a relationship with everybody to try to promote that like community safety aspect of it. And I think that some of you know, like there's protesters who may get arrested more than once, or you know, other people that may get arrested more than once. We understand like that is a thing that occurs, and that's why a bail fund must be big enough to absorb that kind of thing, because people can't really control like under what circumstance they get arrested. The only thing that keeps you from getting arrested is your physical distance from the police. So we understand that the bail fund needs to be a community effort, not just a kind of a loan.
Well, I do know that there have been folks around the state who have looked at the issue of eliminating cash bail unlike other states, North Carolina's statute actually says that cash bail bonds should be a last resort. And so one of the proposals that has been submitted to the task force would set up a more strict rule of practice, if you will, for judges to follow that would hopefully encourage them to see, judges and magistrates, to see cash bonds as a last resort and in limited circumstances rather than the default option. And so we have some wiggle room even within existing law, separate from whether or not we need to change our statutes. But
could I respond to that real fast?
Yes, please.
Thanks. So I've heard on numerous occasions in different scenarios at I forget what it's called, the Conference on Fines and Fees, and from different legal aids around the state, they recognize that some areas already have that general practice of considering someone's financial situation before levying a cash bond on someone, and they don't always follow that, and there's no reason to follow that. So it's a purely opt-in thing, and in practice, people haven't been following that. So one of the requests from legal aid has been that we document who gives out cash bonds, like which magistrates are following this and which ones aren't. But we don't have the manpower to do this. This needs to be something that the state does and enforces, because there is no reason why anyone would follow that. It would just be personal preference. So there needs to be a rule, especially for capping those fines or the bond amount.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Let's move on to the next issue. We are going to hear from Superior Court Judge Laura Cubbage on the question of the consequences of convictions. Judge Cubbage.
Good morning, and thank you, Attorney General Stein and Justice Earls, for putting this together, and thank you for asking me to give my 2 cents on this matter. Regarding the consequences, I think it goes back to what my focus was in speaking. It goes back to criminalizing poverty. Being in probation court this week, it has been extremely taxing on my mentality to see in 90% of the cases that I have heard this morning on probation violations have been monetary violations. And a lot of those recommendations from probation officers has been either to continue a person on probation who we already know does not have the ability to pay, and especially in the situation that we find ourselves in as a society with the pandemic, or either incarcerating someone for not having the ability to pay. Of course, you can't revoke the probation, but it's been asked of me to enter what we call a 90-day CRV, which is a 90-day confinement in response to a violation. I think that also ties into racial bias or racial equity training, because sometimes it's easy for judges to sit at a certain, in our seat and think that the litigants that come before us are in the same situation that maybe we might be. And having to remit fees all week, that in my opinion never should have been placed. It baffles me that at the front end of a case, we have judges that will say your affidavit shows that you cannot afford a lawyer, but at the back end of that case, we have judges that are putting thousands and thousands of dollars worth of fees and fines. You have supervision fees for probation. You have jail fees if you have to spend some jail time. you have programs that cost, and then you have your court fees and fines. And going back to something Celeste had said, I think it would be good if there was a cap. Now, I don't know that the court has the ability to stop and go dig deep, take a deep dive into everyone's income and try to figure out what percentage. But I think it would be a good rule of thumb if we could get some racial equity training, because I'm seeing this mostly in our African-American defendants for our judges, and that be a requirement for judges. And I think it would also help if we could put a cap, or either if we've said that they, if we've approved them to have a court-appointed lawyer, then perhaps the supervision fee should automatically be waived, or the court fine should automatically be waived, or you know, just to give people an opportunity to get themselves out of a situation versus going further deep into a hole. So I would really love, as a trial court judge at this point, because I intend not to be soon, I would really love for the task force to look into something that would help our litigants to come out of the situation and not have themselves, you know, have dug deeper into that. So thank you guys. I thank you for allowing me to speak. I am in court right now, so I am going to jump off this call, get back on the bench, and you guys have a blessed weekend.
Thank you so much, Judge, for sharing your experience. And I hope I would have, you raised a lot of questions, but I do understand you've got to get back in the courtroom. So I'll pose these to the group in general, and we can possibly get some responses during the discussion. But it seems you have a minute. So here's,
I do. Yes.
So here's my specific question. Do you think that what you're proposing is something that requires a legislative change, or is there some other mechanism by which we can get to where you're talking about in terms of the levying of fines and fees?
I think if we could get a legislative change, that would be the perfect remedy, because then that's a standard that all judges would have to follow. Right now, it's in each judge's discretion. And as I said, each judge doesn't necessarily see it the way I'm seeing it. I am not on the front end going to appoint an attorney to help a litigant because of financial distress, and then on the back end of that case at resolution, put thousands of dollars worth of fines. At this point, thank God that Chief Justice Beasley has stopped with the tracking of how many fees and fines that judges are actually waiving or remitting, because I probably would be at the top, to be honest with you. But if we can't get a legislative change, then I think it's something that maybe judges should have to go through some type of training. You know, it may be something that a lot of judges are not even recognizing. But again, you know, seeing this in probation court all week, it just baffles me. Like, how do we expect for litigants to get back on the right track? And if they don't pay their fees and fines, we all know it ends up being something likely sent to the DMV. Then they're dealing with revoked license. Then they're coming back. It's just a never-ending cycle, and we really have to take a look at it.
And you mentioned the probation part of the system, if you will, and I can tell you that the working group dealing with this has training is sort of a no-brainer. Yes, we can recommend that. I do put a question mark up. You know, we've heard some comments about how there's no real data that racial equity training makes a difference for police. I think we're asking the question, is there data that shows that racial equity training, is the real data that it reduces outcomes, racially disparate outcomes? Because we go back to, we have to remember that the mission of the task force is develop and implement solutions that will eliminate disparate outcomes. So I think I think we all understand the value of training. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying training isn't valuable. It definitely is. But I'm wondering if you would think that training for probation officers would be valuable, or are there other types of, and I see that I misspoke and that it's implicit bias training, not racial equity training. That's the issue. So I apologize because I recognize those are different things. Don't mean to collapse them. But are there other changes with the probation department that we should think about?
I think that the probation, from what I'm hearing and seeing, the probation officers are actually following the training that they're getting and the policies. I think the policies need to be changed because probation officers cannot come in and recommend. They have to follow the policy of what they're seeing as far as the violation. So for instance, they cannot recommend remitting fees or transferring fees to a civil judgment and terminating probation. They have to recommend some type of, I don't want to say punishment, but some type of, let's say for lack of a better word, citation for the violation. It's up to a judge to decide that I'm going to remit the fees or transfer the fees to a civil judgment and terminate the probation. And even, probation, if it's monetary, then, of course, the probation is in line to be terminated. As far as the data that you're looking for, I would say check into the program at Mecklenburg County, led by Judge Lou Tross and Judge Elizabeth Tross. The data is there that the training and the racial equity as well as racial bias, implicit biases training, in fact, does help. And I think it's absolutely needed. It does help. The data is there. Guilford County has not as a whole participated in that. I don't know if Forsyth County has or not, but it absolutely is something that helps.
Thank you. I really appreciate you sticking with us for a few more minutes. That was very helpful to me. Our final topic for court practices is to turn to Brennan Alberol, who is going to talk with us about criminal trials.
Thank you, Your Honor, and Mr. Attorney General. I'm Brennan Aberley. It's a hard to pronounce last name. I'm an attorney here in, you're just fine. An attorney in Greensboro and a member of UNC School of Government's Racial Equity Network. I'll keep my remarks brief, but I will say this. If anybody wants to follow up, I've written these remarks out. I'm happy to send them, forward them along to you in a little more detail with some supporting data. But what I want to say all has one theme that goes along with it, which is, if the goal here is to address inequality in our criminal justice system, we have to confront both implicit bias as one of the root causes, but also mass incarceration, which is one of the unfortunate results. And though it's going to be difficult to eradicate implicit bias completely, I think the main goal of what I want to talk about is you take a case continuum everywhere from when you're charged to when that case is dismissed or you're sentenced, both of which are equally important because they also can bring up issues of bias. And you try to find areas where discretion is involved. And those areas where discretion is involved are places where implicit bias can play a role and create a more disparate impact. And that's the thing about implicit bias is it's not just sinister people, twirling their mustaches who are trying to make the system bad. Implicit bias is something that, ostensibly good people participate in and contribute in. And so, I'm very lucky in Guilford County. We've got a great relationship with our district attorney's office and our judges. It's a very collegial bar. But the fact is that we all participate and contribute in ways that we don't fully appreciate. And so, I think what we need to do is create little obstacles to help you kind of, as I guess Representative John Lewis would say, get in the way of these types of harms. I would break that down into 5 quick categories. So pretrial detention, the discovery phase, prosecutorial decision-making, which would include charging, plea negotiation, and calendar authority, jury selection and instruction, and sentencing. You've talked a lot about pretrial detention, but I want to add this very quick point is, our statute, 15A 534 is beautiful. It's got gorgeous language in it. It not imposing a secured bond is the default. It says it specifically in subsection B. The problem is it's routinely ignored. And there are requirements that you have written procedures or written, reasonings that are recorded for when you don't impose a secured, for when you do impose a secured bond, and it gets ignored. Mandating implicit bias trainings for judges, magistrates in particular, I think is important. But I think that there needs to be a way to give more teeth to what happens, because, you know, if you're trying as a judge to decide if somebody's a flight risk or they're dangerous, think about all the ways implicit bias can play a role in that. You know, people of color have less generational wealth, or perhaps they're perceived due to racist stereotypes about Black men being more violent. All of these things permeate several different judges' minds, and they result in these secured bonds in situations where the statute clearly says we shouldn't have it. It's rare that we solicit any evidence about somebody's ability to pay. I never hear any of that put on the record. And though there are plenty of well-meaning judges about this, you know, I think one of, if I had to put together a wish list on this, other than bias trainings, whether they work or not, is I think there just needs to be a way to pull some of the discretion out of this. So, you know, we should not have cash bonds for misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies unless you have failed to appear on that case specifically. Perhaps I also think we should increase funding for pretrial services. A lot of these organizations are great. There's statistics and data to show that most of these people do show up to court, and having a more robust pretrial services, you know, system in place to maybe in exchange for lower bond guidelines can play a good role. But the sad truth is I can't say over 10 years how many times I've had to stand next to somebody, and it breaks my heart that they're going to plead guilty to a crime and get probation because they want to get out of jail, and they've got cases where they're either innocent or the state can't prove it at trial. And it's unfortunate. The School of Government, UNC School of Government, actually put together aggregated several studies across the country where they've monitored case outcomes in various states. And it is a fact that people who are in custody pretrial, they get longer sentences, they plead to more serious charges, and they obviously get convicted at much higher rates. Moving on to discovery, we do not have a good discovery statute regarding district court. And so most of the times we don't see body-worn camera for misdemeanors because we're not entitled to get it. It is hard to shine light on bad behavior and deter bad behavior if we can't get access to that. So I think that's a good place. I think that we could reform our discovery statute a little bit better, and put some more teeth in it. I had a case several months ago where I got handed 6 hours of jail phone calls halfway through a trial, and I only had 2 hours to review them. And over my objection, they got let into trial. And there's so much discretion to not impose a sanction that these discovery violations, there's just not a lot of teeth to that statute. Prosecutorial decisions, you know, not every state has the.
So sorry to cut you off, but we're right at a little bit.
Absolutely. I have plenty of other information. I'm happy to follow up on any of those topics.
Well, thank you so much. And please, we do want your written submission. And at the risk of imposing on the 10 minutes we have for everyone to comment, I just want to ask you one quick question, and that is about the thing you jumped over, jury selection. The working groups talked a little bit about Batson, is it effective in North Carolina, and in particular pointed to Washington State's reform, which has, in Washington State, they've not eliminated peremptory challenges, but they've imposed an entirely different regime, a lot more strict than Batson, to try to get at this issue of African Americans being excluded from juries. Do you have any thoughts on what solutions would work there?
Yeah, well, I mean, the answer to your very first question is, yeah, Batson doesn't, I mean, I don't know when the last time a Batson challenge was won in North Carolina. Clearly, there's not a lot of teeth to that. I mean, we can mandate recording jury selections. We can have jury questionnaires. We can mandate that people put their race on the record. We can have implicit bias jury instructions added to the pattern jury instructions. And on peremptory challenges, absolutely. I mean, you know, it's the defendant's the one that has everything to lose at stake in a trial. And it is unfortunate that peremptory challenges can provide some cover for potentially racially biased juror strikes. I'm not opposed to striking peremptory challenges for the state altogether, but I think that there's probably some middle ground there about at least stating some reasons on the record and requiring jury selection be recorded so that there could potentially be more on the record if a Batson challenge is, handled in the Court of Appeals.
Thank you. And I'll tell you that there is already underway, I think, through AOC, some effort to consider having part of the instruction video that potential jurors get include some instruction on implicit bias and ways to counter it. So there's some movement in that direction. At this point, let me open it up for anyone who wants to quickly make a comment. And I would ask you to tell us are there additional, the question of what happens in the court system is a big one. Are there ideas or issues or problems that we haven't identified yet that you want to lift up? Or alternatively, can you help us prioritize? What should we pursue to really achieve structural change? Another way of asking that question is what are the top 3 changes that would most benefit your court system in your county? And I will try to find people, so just raise your hand. Okay, Sahir, Sahir, go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, thank you, Justice Earl and Attorney General Stein for having this. What it sounds to me like we were trying to change the culture. And when one thing about the culture of this system is based on revenue. And I wanted to know if you all were looking at the revenue that is generated, because in some jurisdictions, even from tickets all the way to trials, they're trying to produce revenue. And even when somebody does go to prison, then they're looking at free labor. Are you all looking at how that revenue tag is influencing a lot of these things that you want to correct? Thank you for your time.
So I certainly think that in general, the issue of particularly the fines and fees and how they contribute to operating expenses for the court system has already come up as a result of the pandemic, because we haven't been having court in the same way, and those revenues are down. Of course, this is an advisory task force, and that's ultimately a legislative question. But it's definitely something that I think you will see the task force grappling with, not only how should revenue be generated, but then what elements of the system maybe should be funded differently to reduce the racial disparities. But thank you for that, for raising that. I don't see anyone with a hand. Oh yes. Let's see. Is there anyone? Mr.
Yes.
Aberley? Yes. Oh, Senator Lowe. Sorry, I'll get to you, but Senator Lowe. Thank you. No, go ahead. You were off. There you go.
Yes. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. I have a eulogy to do in about 30 minutes, but I did want to say I'm really concerned, and I thank you all for allowing me to be a part. I'm really concerned about hearing what are the legislative concerns you have. What is it that we could be doing in our legislature to help so many of these disparities? Because I've heard so much, and there's a lot to try to begin to address, but I'm really concerned about hearing what we could be doing to help some of this.
And I'm glad you raised that. I think that we are looking really carefully at implementation. So not just here's something that should be done differently, but how do we achieve it? And through the legislature is a lot of that. I'll tell you already in some of the working group sessions, we have legislators on the task force. So Representative Morey and Mecklenburg County Senator
Gustavo, yep.
And so we do have some resources in that regard, but the question that often comes up is, well, what's possible, right? So I think it would be helpful to have that discussion, Senator Lowe, as an interactive one, so that you hear from us what needs to be done, but then we also hear from you about how we get it done and what's possible.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you for being with us this morning. And so is there, I think I have time for one more comment. Was there someone else who wanted to speak who hasn't had a chance to speak? I'm not seeing any other. Okay, Mr. Aberley, you have the last word. I don't see any other hands.
Okay, and thank you very much for offering that. So I'll keep this super brief. The only topic I didn't touch, and I think it goes directly to Senator Lowe's issue, is so sentencing. There is an easy way to do some legislative reform to stop mass incarceration by putting a cap on consecutive sentences for a single incident. So right now there's too much leverage and bargaining power with, say, drug trafficking cases, because it's hard to get charged with drug trafficking without getting 6 different ways that there are mandatory minimum sentences required that can all be stacked consecutively, and it discourages people from exercising their right to a trial. And when I say drug traffickers, it's not this scary people, hauling massive amount of drugs across state lines. I mean, you can get charged with drug trafficking for 4 grams of, say, prescription pills. And the legislature recently passed that First Step Act. And that's, I think, a great example of it's a good idea, but it may have made the problem worse, because if all that statute applies to is people who are charged with the lowest level trafficking and possession alone, which is almost never, because it is hard to get charged with just that and not also sale or transportation. The only situation I can think it's going to apply to is prescription pills, which again, there's going to be a huge racial disparity in who gets charged with that trafficking and who gets charged with other types of trafficking. So we may have created a way for judges to depart downwards for a specific category, but I fear it's only going to expand the racial disparity with respect to drug trafficking cases. Habitual felon, same thing. I mean, I'm all for habitual felon sentences, but without a look back period, we're still punishing people from the 1990s when we had more hyper prosecutorial type of viewpoints, and it was easy to get felonies for things like failing to return a motor vehicle worth more than $4,000 to a rental agency. I mean, we can stack felonies up easily, and you will never exercise your right to a trial again if your offer is, you can take your chances if you're innocent, but you'll serve 10 years if you're found guilty due to habitual offender law. So I think that's a huge area where legislative change can reduce some of the bargaining power, the leverage that prosecutors have, even good, well-meaning prosecutors have, and not discourage people to exercise their right to trial.
Okay. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. So we are 8 minutes away, and I think this is the point where we say just a quick word for everyone about next steps, and I will start by turning it over to Attorney General Stein.
Thank you, Justice Earls. Thank you to all who commented on this part of the agenda having to do with the courts. And I do appreciate Governor Cooper's more holistic recognition about racial inequities, that he's not looking just to that police-citizen interaction, which has been the focal point of the national conversation, but he wants to look at it from the first time a citizen encounters a law enforcement officer all the way to when they leave prison and reintegrate into the community. So that's what our task is. You all have given us a great deal of useful information and creative ideas for us to chew on. Ideas I heard about was preventing poverty arrests. Also, don't criminalize poverty. Specific training for law enforcement. Civilian review board with real power. Ensuring that we pay officers adequately in order to make it an attractive place to go to work. Having a cap on fines or fees that is connected to someone's ability to pay. Having some sentencing reforms. So many very useful ideas that we will take back to the task force and to the various working groups that are working on these issues. And I could not be more appreciative of everybody taking their time and sharing their wisdom and ideas. Justice Earls.
Just a quick word about where we go from here. If you aren't aware of it already, there is a website where all of the materials for the task force are located, and that's ncdoj.gov/TREC, TREC. And there you can, there'll be the link for the video of this session, as well as all of our other sessions, all the materials that task force members get, as well as the public comments. We are transparent, and all of that is available. Be rest assured that we are saving the chat. So everyone who for this session put comments in the chat, those we have those as well. And we plan to have additional, we will have other regional listening sessions, but we also have additional public hearings, and in part to get some feedback on some proposals that we're considering. So we will take the input that you've given us, but there'll also be additional opportunities to comment. And I think, as I said at the outset, while our report is due December 1st, our work continues beyond that time in trying to implement. And I really do appreciate all of your input. I think we've got a lot that's going to be useful for our working groups. And I am just grateful to you. I look forward to continuing to work with you going forward.
And Justice Earls, just if I may, and I know that we're now messing up the agenda, but I did see Judge Hartsfield had a couple comments. So if you would like Judge Hartsfield to give us 1 minute of ideas before we close off, I wanted to hear from you since you had so many good ideas in the comment section.
You're on mute.
You're still on mute, Judge. Nope, still there. There we go.
Hello, and thank you, Attorney Stein, and thank you, Justice Earls. One of the things that I want to make sure that this conversation does not exclude, even though I realize that there are lots of conversations about this, but Forsyth County particularly has seen a huge increase in violence among juveniles. And I think that the juvenile arena is almost the beginning of how we start this conversation, particularly as it relates to placements and other areas that affect them greatly. So some of the things that I've been thinking about, particularly as it relates to this particular group, is the whole idea that opportunities for African Americans who enter into this system aren't the same as they are for everybody else. And what happens is the maze that juveniles have to go through in order to navigate this juvenile delinquency, which is a form of criminal justice system, is much, much different than it is for white counterparts. So the two things I want to leave. I want to talk about the whole mental health system and the whole talking about policing and mental health. Well, one of the things that's really difficult to get for African American youth are something called PRTFs. And those are placements that are psychiatric residential placements that some way we are having just a difficult time getting our LME and our mental health people to find placements that are appropriate, because a lot of times they will just deny African American youth who put them into this system where we're talking about where there's lots of racial inequity. Another thing I want to talk about is appointment of counsel, class 3 misdemeanors. Right now, class 3 misdemeanors are not allowed to have a court-appointed lawyer. And what happens is that it seems okay on the day that you say, well, there's no likelihood of incarceration. But for somebody who has a second-degree trespass or shoplifting case and those kinds of cases, it's really imperative that they have counsel, even though it may be their first offense, because it has long-term consequences. That second-degree trespass will keep you from getting a housing authority placement. It'll keep you from having a place in the housing authority because it's on your record. And the expungement laws have not gone to the point where they automatically are erased simply because you had a class 3 and there was no chance of incarceration. So we need to relook at that whole process. For shoplifting charges, which are class 3s, it may not have an effect on you going to jail, but it has an effect on you getting a job, because we know that employers will hire someone with a drug conviction much quicker than they will with a theft conviction. So we really need to relook at how we are appointing lawyers and who we are appointing lawyers to in these situations. And of course, I always push for drug courts. Treatment is the best option for mental health, and we need some funding for mandatory drug courts, family courts in all jurisdictions, particularly in Forsyth County.
Judge, thank you for that final word, and sorry to have interrupted Justice Earls. Anything final before we conclude?
No, just thank you. I do appreciate those last comments, and I want to assure you that juvenile justice issues are in one of the working groups, but hearing your specific experience there in Forsyth County is really helpful, so thank you.
Great. Pastor Covington, Dr. Vereen, Bishop Fulton, all of you, very much appreciate everyone's time today, and if you have ideas, keep them coming. We're nowhere near done. Thanks so much.
You ready for me? All right, here it comes.